Access to medical equipment, from pulse oximeters to ventilators, has been front and center through the pandemic. For a fortunate minority of the world, well-funded hospitals have equipment that's purchased, maintained, and supplied with consumables by the original manufacturer. Step outside of those privileged countries, and what little equipment there is often lies idle because there aren't spare parts or consumables or authorized service engineers. There's a growing awareness that underserved communities need appropriate, affordable, reliable technology for everything from basic power and light to life-saving medical devices. Simply dumping cheap technology in those regions won't work. If it's going to be sustainable, it has to be able to run on the available consumables. You need locally available spares. And crucially, there has to be someone locally who can repair it. Researchers and students in university labs around the world have often applied themselves to the challenge of frugal innovation, especially during the pandemic, and sometimes with very impressive results. However, the traditional approach is that we invent something, we patent it, and we exploit that intellectual property, usually meaning that the results of their work are controlled by the university or by a local startup, but very, very rarely by the communities that they aim to serve. In the world of tech transfer, inventors are usually pushed to protect, as they call it, an idea with legal mechanisms that stop other people using it, like patents. This means the inventors or their employers control who can use that invention, and it grants them the right to claim royalties. The OpenFlexure project takes more or less the opposite stance, and this talk is about why working openly is such an important part of what we do. Normally, when I talk about the OpenFlexure microscope, I give the title Robotic Microscopy for Everyone. And why does everyone need microscopy? Well, for me, the answer is simple. It's this. This is a Plasmodium falciparum. It's the parasite responsible for malaria. And every year, that affects about 200 million people. And of those, something like 500,000 will die. And the vast majority of these will be children under the age of 5 in Africa. The OpenFlexure project creates a digital microscope that is highly automated, and it has a lot of advantages. We can do better quality assurance of diagnosis because it keeps proper records. We can train technicians better because they're able to seek a second opinion when they're unsure, and because they're able to point at things on a screen rather than that classic microscopy challenge of looking down the eyepieces and not really having any idea of what the other person sees. And lastly, it's designed to be produced locally. And that is so key to getting around a lot of these sustainability issues where I can make a very cheap, very good microscope, but if it breaks once it's in the community that need it, it's not very useful. And I guess it's worth backtracking and asking, why do we need all of this diagnosis? Humanity has made great progress towards eliminating malaria. Those numbers, while tragic, are nowhere near as bad as they were a couple of decades ago. But that means it's even more important than ever that we have good diagnostics so that we know that we're treating people for the correct condition. This local production aspect means that the OpenFlexure project is very much a global community project. It started as something of a curiosity in my lab, and it grew from there. The interesting thing about it was that it's very easy to replicate. 3D printing means that I can send you the designs, or indeed you can get the designs from the website, and you can have one in your hand a day or two later. And this works very well as a piece of open hardware. So all of the designs, all of the instructions, all of the software are licensed so that anybody is permitted to use them and indeed to sell them. And my team and I have put a lot of effort into making it easy to reproduce. There are lots of reasons for that, and I'll come to those later. But suffice to say, it's very important both for making sure that our science is good and for making sure that the maximum number of people have access to the technology. And finally, we've worked very hard to try and build a community around the microscope. And that community includes all sorts of different people. There are entrepreneurs and engineers who want to build it and sell it. There are scientists who want to use it in their research. There are clinicians and pathologists who want to use it for diagnosis and for training. The case for sharing the design. I'm a scientist. I work mostly in a research lab. And so one of the big things that I'm concerned with is making sure that my experiments are reproducible. Allowing other people to build on my work reduces duplication of effort, and it enables experiments that come afterwards to be more sophisticated. The automation that is introduced by the OpenFlexure microscope and many of its related technologies, some of which are our projects, many of which are projects by other people, they enable scientists to take more data that is more consistent. And there's a growing community of scientists using and improving the OpenFlexure microscope for a range of work that my lab couldn't hope to do on its own. And the ability to reproduce that experiment precisely and to understand all of the components that are part of it is crucial to doing science that is repeatable and trustworthy. There are so many examples of pieces of scientific work where it would be very difficult to reproduce the apparatus, and that ultimately is bad for science. Now, much of the funding for the OpenFlexure microscope has come from the UK's aid budget through a mechanism that supports research that furthers global challenges, called the Global Challenges Research Fund. And I think the humanitarian argument for sharing our hardware openly is even clearer. If we can give away an innovation with no strings attached, or at least with very few strings attached, then the local innovators who can produce it really own what they do. That means they can keep supporting products after the inventors have moved on. It allows products to be customized for local markets, because I don't know the needs of Tanzanian hospitals half as well as Tanzanian hospitals do. And most importantly, it means that universities or companies or individuals based in rich countries no longer have complete control. And I'll say that again because I think it's really important. Sustainable development means rich countries have to stop holding all the keys. That's not as easy as you'd think. It requires trust in both directions. I have to trust my Tanzanian manufacturing partner will do a good job. They have to trust that I won't do something to undermine the product they're developing. There's no way to force someone making an open hardware design that I've released to pay me royalties or to allow me any control over what they do, because in a very real sense, I don't have exclusive rights over that design anymore. But if our aim is sharing access to scientific advances so that everyone can have a better life, that's a good thing. But it's not the way we do it at the moment. The well-trodden path to commercialization at a UK university typically goes something like this. A researcher has an idea. That researcher then possibly gets a grant to work on it further, but one way or another, the idea is developed into something that could potentially be useful to the world. At that point, they disclose the details of that invention to their university's tech transfer office. If the university's tech transfer office think that the idea will fly, usually at that point you apply for a patent. And it's that patent that makes sure that the university has the legal mechanisms to control who produces it, to demand royalties, to exert some measure of control over what happens to the design. The hope is that that patent will then be licensed to a commercial partner, and the commercial partner will bring to market a product based on that idea. The company is then the only one allowed to make the products, and the idea is that they can then recoup their initial investment and hopefully a bit more, thanks to the exclusivity that the patent grants them. Now, all of these legal relationships are expensive to arrange, and largely they serve to ensure that the university keeps control. A big part of the justification for that is to make sure that the IP isn't bought outright from the university and then not used. There have been cases of work developed in a university that is then bought by a company and effectively left in the cupboard for various reasons. And so if we just license the IP, the university is able to take it back and give it to another partner if the first partner doesn't achieve any impact with it. And ultimately, the researchers and the funders want to see ideas make it from labs into the real world. And so this licensing approach is helpful in making sure that things don't get stuck at later stages in the process. Now, in the OpenFlexure project, we've taken a very different approach. It still starts with an idea, but that idea is shared openly very early on. One of the big disadvantages of the patent approach is that up until the point that your patent is granted, or at least applied for, you need to keep everything secret. You can't discuss your work with other experts in the field. You can't discuss your work with a wide variety of potential users. In fact, you can only discuss your work with people who are under a non-disclosure agreement. And that makes collaborative development really hard. If we share things openly at the very start, then we can do the development much more openly. We can talk to lots of different people. They can help us fix problems. They can show us that actually there are needs that we're not addressing. Because it's all done as part of a community. And that community includes your users, other engineers, people who might one day produce it. And so they can take part in the development. And even once the product appears to be finished, they can help to improve it because they have all the designs and the rights to do that. It doesn't preclude commercialization, and absolutely open hardware can be produced and sold and can be made available commercially. But it's not an exclusive deal. So if somebody else wants to produce it or wants to make a new product based on an existing one, as is so often done with scientific instruments, then they are free to do that too. Our open license, which comes from CERN, is non-exclusive, and that's ultimately what it does, but it also requires people to release designs of hardware based on the open license, and so it propagates. If someone improves the microscope, I can then improve on their improvements. Of course, getting to the stage where there's some blueprints to release is just the beginning. Making a product and certifying it for medical use is a long journey. With the OpenFlexure microscope, our hope is that we can keep as much of that journey in the open as possible, so that not just one, but a whole network of local producers can spring up across the world. A big challenge is finding sustainable funding for the local manufacturers and for the scientists who'd be needed to develop and sustain the designs. We're confident that our business model can become sustainable in the future, but it will take a significant chunk more work and more funding to get there.